I built an empire with my bare hands and a single printing press in a dusty garage. For 40 years, I sacrificed everything to make sure my family would never know the taste of an empty refrigerator or the panic of an overdue bill. When my chest tightened a month ago and the doctors rushed me into surgery, my son-in-law stood by my hospital bed. "Let me handle the business," he said. "Focus on getting better." I trusted him. I handed him the authority to keep the lights on. 4 weeks later, I drove to the factory I built from the ground up, put my key in the door, and found out my legacy had been stolen. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled his life and took back my empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always comes with a devastating price. The drive down Industrial Avenue felt like coming home. The rhythmic hum of the machinery usually carried through the morning air a mechanical heartbeat that I had listened to since I was 30 years old. The steering wheel of my old Ford truck felt solid under my grip. The doctor had cleared me for light duty yesterday, and the quiet 4 weeks of recovery had felt like a prison sentence. I pulled into the Founder parking space, gravel crunching under the heavy tires. The factory building stood tall against the pale morning sky. Pierce Packaging Solutions. My name painted in broad navy letters across the corrugated steel. I walked up the concrete steps to the main glass double doors. The morning air was crisp. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key. It was the original key I had cut 40 years ago. Its edges were worn smooth from decades of use. It was heavy, carrying the weight of sleepless nights, missed family dinners, and sheer survival. I slid the brass key into the lock. It stopped halfway. I pushed a little harder, thinking the cold metal was just stiff. It did not budge. I pulled the key out and looked at the deadbolt. It was not the scratched matte metal I had installed. It was gleaming, polished chrome. A completely different lock. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. I looked through the tinted glass doors. The reception area was identical, but the security system on the wall had a new keypad. The glass doors suddenly pushed open from the inside. Cameron walked out. He was not wearing the standard safety vest and polo shirt required on the factory floor. He was wearing a dark, custom-tailored Italian suit that easily cost $3,000. His hair was slicked back, and his leather shoes clicked sharply against the concrete. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked annoyed. He held a medium-sized cardboard box in his hands. "Good morning," Warren, Cameron said. His voice was entirely too calm. "You are supposed to be resting. What are you doing here?" I looked from the shiny new lock to the custom suit. My heart began to beat a little faster, but I kept my voice perfectly level. "Why does my key not work, Cameron? And why are you wearing a runway suit on an active loading day?" Cameron sighed, a heavy, exaggerated sound meant to show patience for a confused old man. He shifted the cardboard box in his arms. "We had to upgrade the security protocols, Warren. Insurance purposes. The auditors said the old locks were a liability." I stepped closer. The scent of expensive cologne wafted off him. "Then give me the new key. I have a production meeting in 10 minutes. Cameron did not reach for his pocket. Instead, he held out the cardboard box. I looked inside. It was the framed photograph of my late wife that always sat on my mahogany desk. Next to it was my vintage brass stapler, my favorite coffee mug, and the first dollar the company ever earned taken out of its frame. I stared at the box, the reality of the situation slowly solidifying in my mind like wet cement. "What is this?" I asked. "Warren, you had a major cardiac event," Cameron said, his tone dripping with manufactured sympathy. "You are 71 years old. The doctors said stress is the enemy. While you were in the hospital, the board and I had a long conversation about the future of the company. We realized it was time for a transition." "I never authorized a transition," I stated, my voice dropping an octave. "I own this company. Actually, you do not run the daily operations anymore." Cameron corrected, a smug smile briefly touching the corners of his mouth. Do you remember the paperwork you signed in the intensive care unit? The general power of attorney? You told me that was purely for hospital emergencies, I said, staring directly into his eyes. I told you it was to authorize payroll and sign vendor checks while I was incapacitated. It was a comprehensive power of attorney, Warren. It gave me the legal right to act as the primary executive to protect the company assets. And my first act as the new chief executive officer was to formally retire you with a full benefits package. You built a great foundation, but the market is changing. You are too old to understand the new supply chain metrics. I am streamlining the operation. You stole my company while I was hooked up to a heart monitor, I said. I did not yell. Yelling is what people do when they feel powerless. I felt a cold, absolute clarity washing over me. I protected the family asset Cameron countered, stepping forward to block the doorway. The business needs young blood. You should be thanking me. Take your things, Warren. Go home. Play golf. Enjoy your retirement. The low growl of a high-performance engine interrupted the standoff. A sleek midnight black sports car pulled into the loading zone, tires screeching slightly. It parked illegally across two marked spaces. The driver's side door opened, and Rachel stepped out. My daughter was wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a leather handbag that cost more than my first printing press. She looked at the factory, then at me, and frowned. She walked up the concrete steps, her heels clicking in time with Cameron's expensive shoes. She stood next to her husband, creating a united front against me. Dad. What are you doing standing out here in the cold? Rachel asked. Her voice was not concerned. It was irritated, like I was a toddler who had wandered out of the house. I looked at the gleaming sports car. That vehicle costs $150,000, Rachel. Where did it come from? Cameron bought it as a company vehicle, she said, crossing her arms. For entertaining clients. Dad, please do not make a scene. We have a very busy morning ahead of us. Rachel. I said, looking at the child I had raised, the child I had worked 80-hour weeks to put through private school. Your husband just handed me my desk belongings in a cardboard box. He changed the locks. He is claiming he owns the company now. I know, Dad, Rachel sighed, taking off her sunglasses. We made the decision together. It is for the best. You are getting forgetful. You belong at home resting. You cannot handle the pressure anymore. You used my medical emergency to forge a hostile takeover. I said, the betrayal burning the back of my throat. I am not forgetful. I am looking right at a thief and a traitor. Stop being so dramatic, Rachel snapped, her voice rising in condescension. You are embarrassing yourself. Cameron is taking the business public eventually. He knows what he is doing. We will make sure you get a generous monthly allowance. You will never have to worry about paying your bills. Just go home, Dad. Let the adults handle the real work now. She turned her back on me, linked her arm through Cameron's, and the two of them walked back through the glass doors. The heavy doors swung shut, locking automatically with a solid mechanical click. I stood alone on the concrete steps, holding the cardboard box of my memories. The cold wind whipped across the parking lot. A younger, weaker man might have banged on the glass. He might have screamed or cried or called the police in a blind panic. I did none of those things. I turned around and walked slowly back to my Ford truck. I opened the passenger door, set the box carefully on the seat, and climbed behind the steering wheel. I shut the door, sealing out the noise of the wind. I did not start the engine. I sat in the heavy silence, taking a deep breath to steady my heart rate. The doctor said stress was bad for me. I was not going to give Cameron the satisfaction of a second heart attack. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my private banking application, the one linked directly to the primary corporate accounts that Cameron thought he controlled. A red notification badge glowed on the screen. I tapped it. It was an automated alert generated by the high-level security protocols I had quietly installed 3 years ago. The alert detailed a transaction that had occurred exactly 10 minutes before I arrived at the factory. Cameron Davis had just initiated a wire transfer. $2 million in liquid capital had been drained from the company payroll account and sent to an anonymous offshore holding company in the Cayman Islands. He was not trying to run the business. He was bleeding it dry. I stared at the numbers on the screen. My sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I put the phone down, started the engine of my truck, and pulled out of the parking lot. They thought I was an old, tired man who would just fade away into the background. They were about to learn that you never lock a predator out of his own territory without expecting him to tear down the entire building. I pulled away from the factory without looking back in the rearview mirror. The $2 million alert on my phone was a ticking bomb in my passenger seat. The morning traffic on the interstate was heavy, but my mind was completely detached from the sea of cars around me. I was calculating. For 40 years, I had treated my business like a living, breathing organism. I knew its pulse. I knew its exact cash flow on any given Tuesday. Cameron thought he had severed the head, but he had only grabbed the tail. I took the downtown exit and navigated toward the financial district. I was not going to the police. The police would freeze the accounts and tie this up in civil litigation for years. By the time a judge sorted it out, Cameron would have washed the money through a dozen shell companies. I needed a surgeon, not a butcher. I parked my truck in the underground garage of the towering glass building that housed my legal counsel. Anthony Russo had been my corporate attorney since we were both 30 years old. He had drafted my first vendor contract on a napkin in a diner. He was a man who understood that the law was a chessboard, and he never lost a piece without a devastating countermeasure. I bypassed the receptionist on the 50th floor and walked directly into his corner office. Anthony was reviewing a deposition, but he dropped his gold pen the second he saw my face. "You look like you are ready to bury a body," Warren Anthony said. He stood up and walked over to the mahogany door, closing it firmly. "I thought you were supposed to be resting at home for another 2 weeks." "Cameron changed the factory locks," I said. My voice was steady, but the quiet rage was bleeding through every syllable. He handed me my personal items in a cardboard box. "He claims the general medical power of attorney gives him total executive control." Rachel backed him up. "They told me to go home and wait for an allowance." Anthony did not offer useless sympathy. His eyes narrowed. He walked back to his heavy oak desk and sat down. "The medical power of attorney was strictly for keeping payroll moving if you slipped into a coma," he stated. "It does not grant him ownership. It is a temporary custodial measure." I know that, I replied, pulling my phone from my pocket and placing it on his desk. "But the bank does not know that. Cameron just wired $2 million from the primary liquid operating fund to an offshore account. He is moving the capital right now." Anthony stared at the screen. The color drained from his face for a fraction of a second before his professional instincts completely took over. He picked up his desk phone and hit a single button. He told his paralegal to cancel his appointments for the rest of the day and bring in a pot of black coffee. "We are going to open the books," Anthony said. "If he is moving that kind of cash, he has been planning this since the moment you went into the operating room." We moved into the adjacent conference room. It was a sterile space with a long glass table and a massive digital monitor on the wall. For the next 3 hours, the room became a war zone of forensic accounting. Anthony accessed the corporate registry and the bank portals using the master credentials we had established decades ago. The screen lit up with spreadsheets and transaction histories. The coffee arrived, but neither of us touched it. I watched my life work dissected into rows of black and red numbers. The first thing we discovered was that the $2 million transfer was not an isolated incident. It was the final blow in a month-long systematic slaughter. Cameron had not been acting as a chief executive officer. He had been acting as a parasite. "Look at the vendor accounts," Anthony said, pointing his laser pointer at a column of red text. "He has not paid a single raw material supplier in 28 days. The cardboard suppliers, the ink vendors, the logistics company, they are all past due." I leaned closer to the screen. "That makes no sense," I muttered. The operating account had $8 million in cash reserves when I went into the hospital. We always pay our vendors net 30. It is the foundation of our credit rating. He is destroying your credit rating on purpose, Anthony replied, his fingers flying across the laptop keyboard. He pulled up the payroll ledger. Look here. He doubled his own salary retroactively. He authorized a massive bonus structure for himself and Rachel. But that is just the surface. He is creating artificial debt. Anthony clicked on a new tab displaying a series of wire transfers from the past 3 weeks. My chest tightened as I read the names of the recipient accounts. They were vague consulting firms registered in Delaware and Nevada. Marketing optimization, synergy management, supply chain consulting. Those are ghost companies, I said, tracing the line of a $50,000 payment. We do not use outside consultants. I built the supply chain myself. He is writing fraudulent invoices to his own shell companies and paying them from the corporate treasury. Exactly, Anthony said, leaning back in his leather chair. He is siphoning the cash reserves out the back door in small increments, so it does not trigger an internal audit. The $2 million wire today was his final sweep of the vault. He knows you are out of the hospital now. He is accelerating the timeline. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city stretched out below us, but all I could see was the factory floor I had built. Why, I asked aloud. If he wanted to steal the company, why bankrupt it? A healthy business is a golden goose. He could have just sat in the big chair and collected a massive salary for the rest of his life. Why bleed it completely dry? Anthony was silent for a long moment. When I turned around, he was staring at a new document on the screen. It was a formal corporate filing. Because he is not planning to run it. Warren, Anthony said, his voice grim. He is trying to make Pierce Packaging Solutions look massively insolvent. Look at this balance sheet he filed with the state last week. He listed the company liabilities as far exceeding the current assets. But that is a lie, I countered. The machinery alone is worth $15 million. The property is prime real estate. We have zero long-term debt. Cameron does not want to run a packaging company, Anthony explained. He does not want to manage employees or deal with supply chains. He wants a massive lump sum of cash. By making the company appear distressed and drowning in sudden debt, he is creating a legal justification for an emergency liquidation. He is going to sell the physical assets to the highest bidder under the guise of saving the company from bankruptcy. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He was not just stealing my title. He was going to sell my machines for scrap and auction off the factory floor. He was going to erase 40 years of my blood and sweat for a quick payday and leave the hollowed-out shell of the company to collapse under the fake debt he created. When I asked, how fast can a corporate liquidator move on something like this? If he has the papers signed, Anthony said, checking the dates on the filings. He could initiate the asset sale by the end of this week. Friday at the latest. He has been planning this meticulously. He fired your accounting firm 2 weeks ago and brought in his own people. They are rubber stamping the insolvency. I thought about the cardboard box sitting in my truck. I thought about the polished chrome locks on the front doors. Cameron thought he had covered every angle. He thought he had trapped me outside the walls while he burned the castle to the ground. But there was one piece of the puzzle he could not control from a spreadsheet. The people who actually ran the floor. I need to know what is happening inside the building, I said, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. The digital records tell us he is burning the house down, but I need to know where he planted the matches. Where are you going? Anthony asked. We need to draft an injunction immediately. We need to go to a judge and freeze his administrative powers. If we file an injunction, he will know we see his entire board, I replied. He will panic and finalize the offshore transfers. Let him think I am just a defeated old man crying in my truck. I need to talk to Thomas. Thomas was my warehouse manager. He had been with me for 30 years. He knew the factory better than I did. If Cameron was bringing in liquidators to appraise the machinery, Thomas would know about it. I left the war room and headed back to the elevator. The silent adjustment had begun. The The glow of the massive digital monitor illuminated the dark mahogany of Anthony Russo's office. We sat in silence for a long time, just scrolling back through the years of financial history before Cameron took over. The screen was a map of my entire adult life translated into columns of revenue and reinvestment. Anthony pulled up the historical compensation ledger. He highlighted my personal salary for the last 15 years. It was a modest number. It was the salary of a mid-level manager, not the founder of a multi-million-dollar manufacturing empire. "You lived like a monk," Warren Anthony said quietly, his eyes scanning the data. "I have clients who run companies a tenth of your size and they pull millions in personal distributions every quarter. You drove the same Ford truck for 12 years. You still live in the 3-bedroom house you bought when Rachel was in grade school. Cameron looked at these numbers and assumed you were just a scared old man who did not know how to enjoy his own wealth." I leaned back in the leather chair and watched the numbers blur together. Cameron was a man who measured success by the label on his suit and the hood ornament on his car. He looked at my worn boots and my simple life, and he saw weakness. He saw a man who had worked himself to the bone for nothing. But he did not understand the difference between looking rich and being untouchable. "Open the capital expenditure files from 1998, I told Anthony. Anthony typed the commands, and a new spreadsheet filled the screen. It was a list of massive wire transfers from over 2 decades ago. Millions of dollars moving out of the operating accounts and into specialized engineering firms and high-level intellectual property law practices. When the global shipping industry shifted to automated logistics, I realized that standard packaging was going to become obsolete," I explained. Everyone else in the industry was buying pre-made assembly machines from overseas. They were taking on massive corporate debt to fill their factory floors with equipment that would be outdated in 5 years. I did not want to rent my future. I wanted to own the foundation of the industry itself. I spent 4 years practically living on the factory floor. I worked with the best mechanical engineers in the state to design a proprietary folding arm mechanism. It was a piece of machinery that could assemble and reinforce heavy-duty corrugated shipping boxes twice as fast as anything else on the market. It was the holy grail of packaging logistics, but inventing it was only half the battle. Securing it was the real war. Every time the company made a profit, I did not take a bonus. I did not buy a vacation home or a luxury vehicle. I took every spare dollar and poured it into a fortress of legal protection. I paid lawyers like Anthony to file patents on every single gear, every single sensor, and every single line of automated code that ran those machines. Anthony nodded slowly as he opened the intellectual property registry on his computer. He pulled up the patent filings. There were dozens of them. They formed an impenetrable wall around the technology that powered Pierce Packaging Solutions. Cameron only looked at the liquid cash, I continued. He saw $8 million in the bank and thought he had found the treasure room. He thinks the factory floor is just a collection of heavy metal that he can auction off to a corporate liquidator by Friday. He looks at a machine and sees a depreciating physical asset that he can trade for a quick payout to fund his new lifestyle. Anthony smiled for the first time since I had walked into his office. It was a cold, sharp smile. "He does not know about the licensing structure," Anthony said. "He does not know anything," I replied. "Cameron stole the operating company, but the operating company does not own the patents. The operating company merely holds a license to use the machines. Those machines on the factory floor are customized proprietary hardware. Without the active legal patents attached to them, they are basically giant, expensive paperweights. If Cameron brings in a corporate liquidator to strip the factory, the liquidator is going to assume they are buying standard industrial equipment. They are going to pay Cameron millions of dollars for the physical metal. But the second they try to plug those machines in or resell them to a competitor, they will be committing massive intellectual property theft. Cameron is completely blind to the actual value of the empire he hijacked. He is so obsessed with the illusion of wealth, the sports cars, the expensive dinners, the offshore accounts, that he never bothered to look at the architectural blueprints of the company itself. He believes he is executing a brilliant corporate raid. He thinks he has completely disarmed me by locking me out of the building and draining the bank accounts. But by draining the accounts and preparing to sell the machines, he has crossed a line that he can never walk back from. He is not just a terrible businessman anymore. He is actively preparing to commit federal wire fraud and the sale of stolen intellectual property. He has spent the last month digging his own grave with my company credit card, and he is too arrogant to realize he is standing at the bottom of it. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost noon. Cameron had fired my loyal senior staff, and he was undoubtedly clearing the floor for the liquidators right now. He thought he had won. He thought I was sitting at home defeated and broken, waiting for my allowance. I told Anthony to close the spreadsheets. We had seen enough. We knew exactly how Cameron was going to try and sell the company. Now it was time to let him think his plan was working perfectly. We needed him to commit entirely. We needed him to put his signature on the final documents that would lock him inside the burning building he had created. The trap was fully set. All we had to do now was hand him the match. I did not go back to the shiny glass doors at the front of the building. Those doors belonged to the illusion Cameron was trying to build. I drove my Ford truck around the perimeter of the 10-acre lot, following the rusted chain-link fence until I reached the rear loading bays. This was the actual heart of the company. The familiar smell of diesel fuel and raw corrugated cardboard filled the air. Usually this area was a chaotic symphony of backup alarms, heavy machinery, and shouting foremen. Today it was entirely too quiet. 2 massive transport trucks sat idle at the loading docks, but no one was loading them. The roll-up doors were shut tight against the afternoon chill. I parked near the employee entrance and stepped out onto the cracked asphalt. The cold wind bit through my coat, but I barely felt it. I was looking for Thomas. I found him behind the industrial dumpsters near the employee parking area. Thomas was not wearing his bright orange high-visibility supervisor jacket. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt, and he was holding a large plastic storage bin. He was 65 years old, and his hands were permanently calloused from 30 years of gripping steering wheels and pulling heavy levers on my factory floor. I stood quietly and watched him open the trunk of his rusted sedan. He placed the plastic bin inside carefully. Beside it was a framed certificate of appreciation I had given him 10 years ago for a decade of perfect attendance. He was packing his entire professional life away into the back of a dirty car. I walked slowly across the pavement. Thomas heard my heavy boots and turned around. When he saw me, his broad shoulders dropped. He looked incredibly tired. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had just watched his house burn down. "Warren," he said quietly, wiping grease from his hands with a dirty shop rag. "I heard you came by the front office this morning. I tried to come out and see you, but the new security guards blocked the warehouse doors. They said we were not allowed to make contact with terminated personnel." Terminated personnel. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. Cameron had actually classified me as a fired employee in my own building. I looked at the empty loading bays and the silent trucks. "Why are you packing your car?" Thomas, I asked, even though I already knew the painful answer. I just needed to hear him say it aloud. Thomas closed the trunk of his sedan with a hollow metallic thud. "He let me go, Warren," he said, looking down at his worn steel-toed boots. "He let all of us go. Me, Sarah from accounting, who kept the books balanced during the recession, David from quality control, Marcus, the floor foreman. Anyone who had been here longer than 5 years was called into the break room at 9 o'clock this morning. Cameron had 2 private security guards standing by the door with their hands on their belts. He handed us severance packages that were an absolute insult and told us our positions had been eliminated due to corporate restructuring. We had 20 minutes to clear out our lockers and leave the property. My hands clenched into tight fists inside my coat pockets. Thomas was not just an employee to me. When the bank threatened to foreclose on my original garage 30 years ago, Thomas had worked 3 straight weeks without pay just to help me fill a massive emergency order that saved the company. He knew the strict maintenance schedule of every single machine by heart. He knew which forklift had a bad transmission and which loading bay door stuck in the winter. Cameron had not just fired a warehouse manager. He had amputated the institutional memory of the entire factory. He cut the lifelines because he was terrified of anyone who was unconditionally loyal to me. He is purging the ranks, I said, my voice low and steady. He is clearing the floor of anyone who might question what he is actually doing with the inventory and the bank accounts. Thomas nodded heavily and wiped sweat from his forehead. He brought in a crew of temporary workers right after he cut us out. They do not know how to run the assembly machines, Warren. They are not even trying to run production. They are just moving pallets out of the way and cataloging the serial numbers on the heavy equipment. They are tagging the automated lines like they are preparing for a massive garage sale. I looked at Thomas. A man who had dedicated his entire adult life to building this dream with me was now standing in a cold parking lot without a job to support his family. Cameron did not care about the human cost. To him, these loyal people were just line items on a spreadsheet that he could delete to make his fake insolvency look more convincing. I reached out and put my hand on the shoulder of my oldest employee. I squeezed firmly. "Do not look for another job yet," I told him. "Take a few days off. Tell Sarah and David to do the exact same thing. You will all be back on this floor with full back pay by Monday morning. I promise you that." Thomas looked at me. He had seen me fight off predatory competitors and ruthless corporate raiders for decades. He knew I never made a promise I could not keep. A small spark of hope returned to his tired eyes. He reached into the front pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a crumpled piece of white paper. "If you are going after him, Warren, you need to see this," Thomas said, smoothing the paper out against the trunk of his car. I pulled it out of the trash can in the main office right before the security guards marched me out. I saw Cameron printing it, and he threw away the first draft because the ink smeared. "It is not just about selling the inventory, Warren. It is a draft agreement with a corporate liquidator. He is selling the whole building by Friday." I stared at the crumpled piece of paper resting on the trunk of the rusted sedan. The wind was picking up, but my focus was entirely on the smeared black ink. The document was printed on heavy legal stock. It bore the letterhead of a firm called Apex Asset Management. I knew that name. They were not investors. They were vultures. They were a corporate liquidation firm based out of Chicago that specialized in buying distressed manufacturing plants for pennies on the dollar and selling the machinery for scrap metal. I leaned closer and read the specific terms typed beneath the letterhead. My chest tightened with every single sentence. It was a preliminary memorandum of understanding. It outlined the complete acquisition of the 10-acre commercial property and all physical assets contained within the factory walls. Cameron had listed the entire mechanical infrastructure of my life work as abandoned industrial salvage. He was offering the whole package to Apex for $4 million. The property alone was appraised at $12 million. The customized assembly machines were worth another $15 million easily. Cameron was willing to take a massive 80% loss just to guarantee a rapid cash closing. He did not care about the actual value of the empire. He only cared about how fast he could stuff his own pockets before anyone noticed the theft. I dragged my finger down the page to the final paragraph. It detailed the timeline for the transaction. The words jumped off the page like a physical threat. The closing date was set for this coming Friday at noon. Apex would arrive with their own transport trucks at 8 o'clock in the morning to begin the immediate removal of all heavy equipment. Once the floor was cleared, the $4 million purchase price would be wired directly to a holding account. I recognized the routing number listed on the paper. It was the exact same offshore Cayman Islands account that Cameron had sent the $2 million to earlier this morning. This was not just a hostile corporate takeover. This was a smash-and-grab robbery on a massive scale. Cameron was planning to liquidate my entire legacy in less than 72 hours. Once that wire transfer cleared on Friday afternoon, he would disappear. He would leave the empty building to face the massive debts he had fraudulently accumulated, and he would be sitting on a beach with $6 million in stolen cash. Thomas watched my face as I read the document. His calloused hands gripped the edges of his car trunk. He printed it right after he fired us. Thomas said, his voice rough with anger. I was walking past the glass conference room on my way out. I saw him pull it off the printer. He read the first page, frowned at a smudge on the ink, and tossed it straight into the wastebasket. He did not even bother to shred it, Warren. He was too busy making phone calls to the bank. He thinks we are all just a bunch of uneducated warehouse workers. He thinks nobody is smart enough to check his garbage. His arrogance is going to be the exact thing that destroys him, I replied, folding the paper carefully and sliding it into the inside pocket of my coat. I looked back towards the massive factory building. The chrome lock on the front door was a distraction. The shiny sports car in the parking lot was a distraction. Cameron was putting on a show for Rachel and the rest of the world while he quietly rigged the building with financial explosives. The ticking clock was deafening now. Today was Tuesday. I had exactly 3 days to stop a multi-million-dollar heist that was protected by a forged medical power of attorney. If I went to the authorities right now with a piece of paper from a garbage can, Cameron would just claim it was a discarded proposal. He would accelerate his timeline and finalize the wire transfers before the police could even secure a warrant to open an investigation. I could not rely on the legal system to move fast enough to save the machines. I had to let him walk directly into his own trap. I had to let him believe that his Friday deadline was completely secure. Thomas took a step forward. What do we do now, Warren? He asked. Do we block the gates on Friday morning? Do we bring the boys back and refuse to let the trucks onto the lot? No, I said firmly. Physical force will just get you all arrested for trespassing. Cameron legally controls the operating company right now. We need him to voluntarily bind himself to the fraud in front of witnesses. We need him to think he has absolutely won. I reached out and shook Thomas by the hand. Go home, Thomas, I told him. Tell your wife to take a deep breath. Do not answer any phone calls from the office. I am going to handle this. By the time Friday morning rolls around, Cameron is going to wish he had never learned how to read a balance sheet. I turned my back on the silent loading docks and walked to my Ford truck. I climbed inside and locked the doors. I pulled the crumpled paper from my pocket and smoothed it out on the steering wheel. Friday at noon. The deadline was absolute. But before Cameron could legally sign the factory over to the liquidators, there was one more document he desperately needed from me. He needed a formal waiver of my remaining founder rights to ensure the title transfer went through without a hitch. I knew exactly when he was going to try and get it. Tonight was his extravagant anniversary party. He was hosting a massive celebration at the country club using my stolen money. He thought I would be too ashamed to show my face in public after being locked out of my own building. He was wrong. I started the engine and put the truck in gear. I was going to crash the party and give my son-in-law exactly what he wanted. The country club was a fortress of privilege perched on a manicured hill overlooking the city. I parked my old Ford truck near the service entrance, wedging it between two catering vans. I did not have an invitation, but I knew the layout of this club intimately. I had paid the membership dues for Rachel when she first married Cameron so she could network with the kind of people she admired. The kind of people who measured a man by the label inside his jacket and not the calluses on his hands. I slipped through the kitchen service corridor, ignoring the shouting chefs and the clatter of silver trays. I emerged into the grand ballroom just as the string quartet began playing a slow classical piece. The sight in front of me made my stomach turn. The room was draped in white silk and decorated with towering arrangements of imported white orchids. Waiters in tuxedos circulated with silver platters of caviar and crystal flutes of champagne that cost $200 a bottle. Cameron had spared absolutely no expense to celebrate his 5th wedding anniversary. He was treating the company treasury like his own personal lottery winning. I stood in the shadows near a massive stone pillar, watching the excess unfold. This was where the vendor payments had gone. This was where the emergency raw material fund had vanished. It was all burning right here in this room to impress a crowd of people who would forget Cameron's name the second his credit card declined. I spotted Rachel standing near an ice sculpture of a swan. She was wearing a diamond necklace that caught the light from the chandeliers and a midnight blue gown that dragged elegantly across the polished marble floor. She was surrounded by 3 other women, all holding champagne flutes and laughing too loudly. I moved closer, stepping behind a large potted palm tree to listen. I needed to hear exactly how she justified what they were doing. "It has been an exhausting month," Rachel sighed dramatically, waving a manicured hand. "The restructuring took a massive toll on Cameron. My father just let the business stagnate for so long. He had absolutely zero vision for the modern market. He was running a multi-million-dollar company like it was a corner lemonade stand." One of the women, a blonde wrapped in an expensive silk shawl, leaned in closer. "I heard you guys finally convinced him to step down. That must have been incredibly difficult. He always seemed so stubborn." Rachel took a delicate sip of her champagne and smiled a cold, hollow smile. "It was a necessary transition," she said, her voice completely devoid of any real emotion. "We had to use the medical power of attorney while he was in the hospital to officially assume control. It was the only way to protect the legacy. He was honestly starting to lose his grip on reality. He came to the factory this morning completely confused about the new security protocols. We had to gently send him home. It is sad, really, but we are taking very good care of him. We are going to set up a nice little allowance for him once the final sale goes through on Friday." The blonde woman raised her eyebrows over the rim of her glass. "A final sale? Are you guys cashing out already? I thought Cameron was going to take the company public." "Cameron realized that the manufacturing sector is just too volatile," Rachel explained, dismissing 40 years of my hard work with a flick of her wrist. "We found a brilliant corporate liquidator who is going to buy the whole property and take the heavy machinery off our hands. It frees up millions in liquid capital for us to invest in real estate and tech startups. Things that actually matter. We are closing the deal on Friday, and then we are taking a month-long vacation to the Amalfi Coast to recover from the stress." My hands gripped the rough bark of the palm tree. The stress. She was talking about stealing my life work, bankrupting my employees, and selling my patents for scrap metal, as if it were a minor inconvenience she had to endure to get a vacation. There was no guilt in her voice. There was no hesitation. She believed every single lie Cameron had told her. Or worse, she knew the truth and she simply did not care as long as it paid for the diamond necklace around her throat. I stepped out from behind the palm tree and walked directly into the light of the chandelier. I did not try to blend in. I was wearing my dark wool coat and my work boots. I looked exactly like a man who had just walked off a factory floor. The string quartet continued to play, but the conversations nearest to me began to die down. People stared. They recognized me not as a peer, but as a relic that had somehow wandered into their modern art exhibit. Rachel saw me first. The hollow smile instantly vanished from her face. Her hand tightened around the stem of her champagne flute. "Dad," she hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "What are you doing here? You are not dressed for this. You are going to ruin the photos." I looked at the ice sculpture, then at the diamond necklace, then directly into her eyes. "I am just here to congratulate the happy couple, Rachel," I said, my voice carrying enough volume to make the blonde woman take a step back. "I heard you had a very stressful month. I wanted to make sure you were holding up okay." Before Rachel could respond, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I turned my head. Cameron was standing right behind me, smelling of expensive scotch and arrogant confidence. He tightened his grip, attempting to physically intimidate me into silence. Warren Cameron said, his tone dripping with fake joviality for the benefit of the watching crowd. "It is so good of you to come out. I know the doctors said you should be resting, but it means a lot to us that you made the effort. Why don't we go to the private lounge area? It is a little too loud out here for a man in recovery." He was trying to manage me. He was trying to push the embarrassing old man into a dark room before I ruined his performance. I did not pull away. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at his hand on my shoulder until he felt the cold authority radiating from me and slowly removed it. "Lead the way, Cameron," I said. "I think it is time we had a quiet conversation about Friday." The heavy oak door of the private lounge closed behind us, cutting off the sound of the string quartet and the clinking champagne glasses. The room smelled of old leather and expensive cigars. A fire was burning in the massive stone hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the Persian rug. Cameron walked over to a crystal decanter resting on a mahogany side table. He poured himself a generous glass of amber liquid. He did not offer me one. He leaned against the edge of the table, swirling the expensive scotch, and looked at me with an expression of complete condescension. "You really should not have come here tonight, Warren," he said, taking a slow sip. "Rachel was right. You look exhausted. The factory is in the past. You need to focus on your blood pressure and your garden." I stood in the center of the room, keeping my distance. "My blood pressure is perfectly fine." "Cameron," I replied, "what I want to know is why you are rushing to sell my life work to a liquidation firm in Chicago. You told Rachel you were taking the company public. But we both know Apex Asset Management does not build companies. They tear them apart and sell the copper wiring." Cameron stopped swirling his drink. A brief flicker of surprise crossed his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. He set the crystal glass down on the table with a sharp click. "So you went digging," he said, crossing his arms. "I suppose Thomas or one of the other warehouse dinosaurs found a piece of paper and came running to you. It does not matter, Warren. It changes absolutely nothing. You built a nice little regional supplier?" Cameron continued his voice, taking on the tone of a university professor lecturing a slow student. "But you are entirely too sentimental. You hold on to employees who should have been replaced by automated software 5 years ago. You keep millions of dollars in cash reserves just sitting in a bank account, doing nothing when it could be leveraged for exponential growth. The packaging industry is dead. The real money is in the liquidation of the assets. I am simply extracting the final value from a sinking ship before it goes under." "You created the sinking ship," I pointed out, my voice remaining dangerously calm. "You stopped paying the vendors. You drafted fraudulent consulting invoices to siphon the cash reserves into an offshore account. You are engineering a fake bankruptcy to justify selling a highly profitable factory for scrap metal." Cameron let out a short, harsh laugh. "Call it whatever you want, old man." The board of directors signed off on the restructuring. The medical power of attorney gives me the absolute right to execute the asset sale on behalf of the corporate entity. By Friday afternoon, the factory floor will be empty. The building will be transferred to the holding company, and Rachel and I will finally have the capital to live the life we actually deserve. You are out of the game." He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a folded legal document and a crisp business check. He walked over and tossed them onto the center of a low-glass coffee table that sat between us. He tapped his index finger against the heavy paper. "Since you already know about Friday, we might as well tie up the final loose end," Cameron said. "The liquidators at Apex are extremely thorough. They know I have the executive authority to sell the operating company, but they want a completely clean title before they wire $4 million. They do not want a bitter former founder coming out of the woodwork in 6 months and filing nuisance lawsuits about corporate mismanagement. They requested a formal waiver of your remaining founder rights, an absolute relinquishment of any claim to the physical assets or the company name." I looked down at the table. The check was resting on top of the legal waiver. The amount printed on the check was $50,000. It was an insulting number. It was the price of a mid-sized sedan. He was offering me $50,000 for a manufacturing empire that generated 10 times that amount in a single month of production. He was offering to buy 40 years of my sweat and sacrifice for the cost of the sports car his wife drove to the factory this morning. $50,000, I said, reading the number aloud. "The machines on the floor are worth $15 million. You are offering me pennies. I am offering you a gift." Cameron snapped his friendly facade, completely dropping. You have zero leverage here, Warren. I control the bank accounts. I control the facility. If you refuse to sign that waiver, I will just stall the Apex deal for a week. Then I will have my lawyers file a petition to have you declared mentally incompetent. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of his cologne was overpowering. I will drag your medical records through a public courtroom, Cameron threatened, his voice a low, vicious whisper. I will testify that your heart condition has caused severe cognitive decline. I will have the court assign me as your permanent legal guardian, and I will sign the waiver myself. He pointed a finger at my chest. If you fight me on this, you will spend the rest of your life trapped in legal battles you cannot afford. I will drain whatever personal savings you have left paying defense attorneys. You will die broke and humiliated. Or you can pick up that pen, sign the paper, take the $50,000, and live out your remaining years quietly. Rachel will not even look at you if you ruin this deal for us. She wants the money just as much as I do. Do not make her hate you. He was using my daughter as a weapon. He was banking on my parental guilt to force my compliance. He thought he had backed me into a corner where my only options were complete surrender or public destruction. He believed he had calculated every possible variable. But as I looked at the legal waiver resting on the glass table, I realized Cameron had just handed me the exact instrument I needed to destroy him. Anthony Russo had explained the legal mechanics perfectly during our meeting. The medical power of attorney Cameron held was a dangerous tool, but it provided him with a certain level of corporate immunity. If Cameron sold the company using only the power of attorney, he could potentially claim in a criminal trial that he was acting in the best interest of the business and simply made a poor financial decision. It would be a difficult fraud case to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, but this waiver was entirely different. This waiver was drafted to satisfy the liquidation firm. By demanding my signature on this specific document, Cameron was attempting to formally transfer the legal ownership of the new debt structure entirely onto his own holding company to clear the sale. He thought he was shielding himself from future lawsuits from me. But the reality was that this document legally bound Cameron to the fraudulent insolvency he had created. He was trying to wash his hands, but he was actually chaining his own ankles to the sinking ship. He needed me to sign it to satisfy the liquidators. I needed him to possess it to satisfy the federal prosecutors. I stared at the $50,000 check. I let my shoulders slump forward, intentionally releasing the tension in my spine. I allowed my breathing to become slightly ragged. I looked up at Cameron and made sure my eyes reflected the exact amount of defeat and exhaustion he expected to see from a broken old man. I had to sell this performance perfectly. If he suspected for a single second that I was setting a trap, he would tear the paper up and run for the airport. I reached slowly into my coat pocket and pulled out my reading glasses. The heavy brass key clinked against them, but I ignored it. I looked at the silver pen resting next to the document. The bait was right in front of him. Now I just needed to secure the lock. How is this section for setting the perfect trap, and do you want to move forward to the exact moment Warren signs it and arms the legal snare? I let out a long, trembling breath and allowed my shoulders to cave inward. The heavy oak chair behind me looked like an absolute necessity. I reached out and gripped the armrest, letting my knees buckle just a fraction of an inch before I sat down. I stared at the glass coffee table as if the $50,000 check was a physical weight pressing against my chest. Cameron watched my performance with the predatory satisfaction of a wolf that had just cornered a wounded deer. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat on the edge of the leather sofa across from me. He did not look at me with an ounce of pity or respect. He looked at me like an obstacle he had successfully cleared from his path. He crossed his legs, resting his expensive leather shoe on his knee, and took another slow, arrogant sip of his scotch. I raised my hands and stared at my own palms. I forced a slight tremor into my fingers. "You are really going to do this, Cameron?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You are going to take the company I built in a garage and sell it to a stripping firm for pennies? What about the legacy? What about the people who depend on that factory to feed their families? There is no legacy, Warren Cameron sneered, leaning forward and tapping the legal waiver with a manicured fingernail. The only thing that matters is capital. You built a brick-and-mortar dinosaur. I am turning that dinosaur into liquid assets that can actually generate real wealth. The employees will find other jobs, or they will not. That is not my problem anymore. My problem is getting your signature on this piece of paper so I can close the deal on Friday. I looked away from him and stared into the fire burning in the stone hearth. I made sure my eyes looked entirely hollow. Rachel knows about all of this, I asked. She is comfortable destroying the only thing her mother and I ever built for her future. Cameron laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Rachel is the one who suggested we move the timeline up. She is tired of waiting for you to pass away to inherit what she deserves. We both want to enjoy our lives now, Warren. Not 10 years from now when you finally decide to let go. The world moves fast. You are just standing in the way of progress. Just sign the paper. Take the check. Go home and plant your tomatoes. I reached out and picked up the silver pen resting on the glass table. The metal felt cold and heavy against my skin. I held it awkwardly, making sure my grip appeared weak and hesitant. I looked down at the waiver. It was a dense legal document filled with clauses designed to completely sever my relationship with the operating company. It explicitly stated that I was forfeiting all rights to intervene in any future sales mergers or liquidations of Pierce Packaging Solutions. It waived my right to sue the current executive board for breach of fiduciary duty. It was exactly what Anthony Russo needed. By signing it, I was giving Cameron the absolute legal authority to execute the sale. But because the company he was selling was currently engaged in massive federal wire fraud and attempting to sell stolen intellectual property, this document transformed Cameron from a rogue executive into the sole mastermind of a criminal enterprise. He was demanding that I hand him the rope to hang himself. He was so blinded by his own greed that he could not see the trap mechanism hidden beneath the paper. I hovered the tip of the pen over the signature line. I paused, letting the silence stretch out in the room. I needed him to taste the anxiety of the deal almost slipping away. I let my hand shake violently enough that the heavy silver pen tapped rhythmically against the glass table. I do not know if I can do this, Cameron, I whispered, shaking my head slowly. It is my whole life. I built it for Rachel. Cameron completely lost his patience. He leaned across the table and grabbed my wrist. His grip was tight and completely devoid of any familial respect. Sign the paper, Warren, he demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, authoritative command. Sign it right now, or I promise you that by tomorrow morning my lawyers will freeze your personal bank accounts pending a competency investigation. You will not even have enough money to buy groceries. You have lost. Accept it and walk away before I ruin you completely. I let out a defeated sigh. I pulled my wrist out of his grasp, rubbing it as if he had actually hurt me. I looked down at the signature line. I pressed the silver pen against the heavy legal paper. I signed my name slowly, making the letters slightly jagged to sell the illusion of an old man surrendering his dignity under extreme duress. The scratch of the pen on the paper was the loudest sound in the room. It sounded like a steel trap snapping shut. The second I finished the final letter, Cameron snatched the document off the table. He did not even wait for the ink to dry. He inspected the signature, carefully running his thumb over the jagged letters to ensure it was authentic. A massive, triumphant smile spread across his face. He folded the document neatly and tucked it into the breast pocket of his tailored suit right next to his heart. He picked up the $50,000 check and dropped it onto my lap. It fluttered down like a dead leaf. It felt like an insult, but I knew it was a receipt. Smart decision, Warren Cameron said, standing up and adjusting his expensive silk tie. You finally did something good for this family. Do not try to come to the factory on Friday. The security guards have your photograph, and they have strict instructions to have you arrested for trespassing if you set foot on the property. Enjoy your retirement. He did not offer his hand. He did not say goodbye. He simply turned around and walked toward the heavy oak door. He opened it, letting the bright lights and the sounds of the string quartet filter back into the room. He stepped out, returning to his celebration, leaving the broken old man sitting alone in the shadows. The door clicked shut. I was alone. I sat completely still for 30 seconds, listening to his footsteps fade away down the hallway. Then the trembling in my hands completely stopped. My spine straightened. The hollow look in my eyes vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating focus that had built an empire from nothing. I picked up the $50,000 check from my lap. I folded it perfectly in half and slipped it into my coat pocket. It was not a buyout. It was evidence of criminal coercion. Cameron had just sealed his own fate. He had the legal authority he craved and the money he had stolen. He thought Friday was going to be the easiest payday of his life. I stood up from the heavy oak chair. I walked over to the fire burning in the hearth and watched the flames consume a heavy log. The illusion of my defeat was flawless. Now it was time to arm the legal snare and tear down his golden cage. I walked out of the country club, and the heavy mahogany doors closed behind me, cutting off the suffocating sound of the string quartet and the meaningless laughter. The night air was freezing, but it felt like absolute freedom. I stood on the top step for a long moment, taking a deep breath of the crisp winter wind. The physical toll of pretending to be a defeated broken man was exhausting. I let the manufactured tremor completely leave my hands. I straightened my spine and rolled my shoulders back, releasing the heavy tension I had forced into my muscles for the last hour. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the crisp edges of the $50,000 check he had thrown at me. It was not a symbol of my defeat. It was the physical evidence of his extortion. I was no longer the helpless victim they desperately wanted me to be. I was the architect of their impending ruin. I walked down the sweeping concrete steps and headed across the expansive parking lot. The valet attendants ignored me completely. My old Ford truck was parked far away from the gleaming sports cars and luxury sedans that belonged to Cameron and his shallow friends. The gravel crunched loudly under my heavy work boots. The silence of the freezing night was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I was about to unleash on my own family. When I reached my truck, I did not immediately open the door. I leaned against the cold metal fender and reached into the inside pocket of my coat. I pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the darkness, casting a pale glow over my hands. Before I could even unlock the device, the phone began to vibrate. The caller identification displayed Anthony Russo. He had been waiting at his desk for my signal. I slid my thumb across the screen and answered the call. "It is done," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the empty parking lot. I gave him exactly what he wanted. I signed the founder rights waiver, and he accepted it without a single second of hesitation. He even gave me a $50,000 check to make it look like a legitimate buyout to anyone looking at the surface of the deal. Through the speaker, I heard Anthony let out a low, sharp breath of absolute satisfaction. "He actually took it," Anthony said, his voice crackling slightly over the cellular connection. "He is even more arrogant than I calculated. That waiver was the final piece of the puzzle, Warren. He thought he was building a massive brick wall to keep you out of the company, but he just locked himself inside a burning room." "Explain the exact legal mechanism," I said, watching my breath turn to white vapor in the freezing air. "I want to know exactly how heavy the steel chains are before we drop him in the deep water." "By forcing you to sign that specific waiver, Cameron officially and legally isolated himself," Anthony explained rapidly. "When he was just operating under the medical power of attorney, he could have argued in court that he was making collective executive decisions on your behalf. He could have blamed the board of directors or claimed ignorance about the offshore wire transfers. But that waiver explicitly transfers all ultimate liability for the asset liquidation directly to his personal holding company. By accepting your complete surrender, he claimed total ownership of the fake debt structure he created. He cannot blame the shell companies anymore," I stated. staring at the dark tree line at the edge of the country club property. "Exactly," Anthony replied, his tone sharp and lethal. "He is now personally and criminally responsible for every single fraudulent invoice and every stolen dollar. When the federal prosecutors look at the financial paper trail, that waiver will prove that Cameron acted alone with malicious intent to defraud the operating company and sell stolen intellectual property." You handed him a loaded weapon, and he pointed it directly at his own chest. "What is our exact next move?" I asked, leaning my head back against the cold truck window. "We let him sleep," Anthony said. "We let him wake up tomorrow and Thursday, thinking he is the smartest and richest man in the city. We let him bring the liquidation firm to the factory gates on Friday morning. I have already contacted my counterparts at the federal prosecutor office. They are reviewing the offshore wire transfers right now. By the time the corporate liquidators arrive, we will have everything we need to shut him down permanently." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The trap was fully armed, and the trigger was perfectly set. I pulled open the heavy steel door of my truck and climbed into the driver's seat. I inserted the worn brass key into the ignition, and the old engine roared to life, shattering the quiet night. I put the truck in gear and drove away from the country club, leaving my arrogant son-in-law to enjoy the final 3 days of his false empire. I woke up on Wednesday morning before the sun even crested the horizon. The house was completely silent, and for the first time in a month, I did not feel the dull ache of betrayal weighing down my chest. I made a pot of black coffee and sat at the kitchen table watching the early morning light slowly filter through the window. The $50,000 check Cameron had thrown at me sat on the wooden surface like a discarded piece of trash. I did not cash it. I simply stared at it while I drank my coffee. It was the physical proof of my son-in-law believing he had conquered me. It represented his arrogance, his greed, and his absolute lack of foresight. I finished my coffee, got dressed in my best dark suit, and drove back downtown to the financial district. We needed to prepare the final documentation. When I walked into the law office, Anthony Russo was already standing by his massive mahogany conference table. The digital monitors we had used the day before were turned off. Instead, the table was covered in heavy legal binders bound in dark green leather. They were not modern digital files. These were the original physical archives of my life. Anthony handed me a thick, heavy folder. The name stamped on the front in faded gold lettering read, "The Martha Pierce Irrevocable Trust." I ran my hand over the letters, feeling the deep emotional weight they carried. Martha was my wife. She passed away 10 years ago, but her name was still the absolute foundation of my empire. When the packaging business first started taking off 40 years ago, I realized exactly how monstrous the corporate world could be. I saw competitors lose absolutely everything to hostile takeovers, predatory lending, and aggressive, frivolous lawsuits. I promised Martha that no matter what happened to the factory, our family would always own the ground beneath it. I hired Anthony back then to build a financial fortress that no one could ever penetrate. We executed a massive legal maneuver that nobody in the industry ever knew about. We split the empire completely in half. Pierce Packaging Solutions, the company Cameron just stole using his forged medical power of attorney, is nothing but an operating shell. It is a management entity. It pays the employees, buys the raw materials, and collects the revenue from the clients. It has a shiny logo and a bank account, but it does not actually own a single physical asset. The 10 acres of prime industrial real estate, the sprawling concrete factory building, and every single patented machine on that floor are owned exclusively by the Martha Pierce Irrevocable Trust. The operating company only leases the building and the machines from the trust on a month-to-month basis. I was the sole trustee. The genius of the structure was its absolute simplicity. If anyone ever sued the packaging company, they could only go after the operating cash. The land and the technology were completely untouchable. Cameron spent the last month poring over the operating company ledgers. He saw the $8 million in cash reserves, and he saw the massive incoming revenue streams. He assumed the entity that paid the bills also owned the house. He never bothered to look at the deep structural architecture of the corporate charter. When he assumed the role of chief executive officer, he only took control of the management shell. He fired my loyal staff and locked me out of the building, but he was essentially just a glorified tenant locking the landlord out of the lobby. He does not own the factory. He does not own the machinery. He does not own the intellectual property. He owns a piece of paper that says he is the manager of a company that rents those things. Anthony opened the green binder and laid out the original trust deed, tracing the property lines on the old faded blueprint. Cameron is trying to sell a 10-acre commercial property and $15 million worth of proprietary machinery to Apex Asset Management. Anthony said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. But he does not hold the title to any of it. He is representing himself as the legal owner of assets that belong to a private trust. That elevates this from a simple civil dispute over corporate control directly into the realm of federal grand larceny and wire fraud. By signing that waiver last night, he cemented his personal liability. He explicitly told the federal government that he is the sole mastermind behind the sale. I looked at the lease agreement Martha and I had signed decades ago. The operating company is required to maintain a strict code of conduct to lease the equipment I pointed out. By intentionally bankrupting the liquid accounts and refusing to pay the vendors, Cameron has officially violated the terms of the master lease. The trust has the legal right to immediately terminate the operating agreement and seize all remaining assets within the facility. He has completely stripped himself of any legal protection. He is standing in the middle of an empty room holding a bag of stolen money. Anthony nodded and pulled out a fresh legal pad covered in handwritten notes. I spent the entire morning on the phone with the federal prosecutor office, Anthony told me, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. I sent them the Cayman Islands wire transfer records and the draft agreement Thomas pulled from the wastebasket. They were highly interested. When I showed them the signed waiver you secured last night, they immediately assigned a task force to the case. They are monitoring the offshore holding account right now. They are just waiting for Cameron to attempt the final fraudulent transfer on Friday morning. Once Apex Asset Management realizes they are buying stolen property, the federal agents will move in and arrest him directly on the factory floor. I looked at the golden letters of my late wife on the heavy folder. Martha would have hated the conflict, but she would have fiercely protected the legacy we built for our daughter. It broke my heart to know that Rachel was completely complicit in this theft. She had chosen a shiny sports car and a luxury vacation over her own flesh and blood. She thought she was securing her financial future by betraying me and throwing me out into the cold. She did not know that she was the primary beneficiary of the Martha Pierce irrevocable trust. The moment I passed away, she would have inherited the land, the patents, and the millions of dollars in licensing fees they generated. I had built the entire fortress just to keep her safe. But by actively participating in the fraudulent takeover alongside Cameron, she had triggered a specific penalty clause Anthony had drafted years ago. Any beneficiary who attempts to defraud the trust automatically forfeits their inheritance entirely. She burned down her own castle just to steal the silverware, I said quietly, staring at the documents that outlined her massive lost future. Anthony placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You cannot save people from their own greed, Warren," he said gently. "You gave them every opportunity to do the right thing. Cameron could have just run the operating company honestly and lived a very wealthy life. Rachel could have respected you and waited for her rightful inheritance. They chose to be thieves. They chose to humiliate you in public. Now they have to face the consequences of stealing from a man who spent 40 years learning how to build an unbreakable vault." Thursday was a day of absolute silence. I stayed in my home and tended to my garden, just as Cameron had mockingly suggested I do. I pruned the rose bushes Martha had planted near the front porch. I watered the dark soil and felt the cold winter sun on my face. I did not answer my phone. I did not drive past the factory to check on the gates. I let the false emperor enjoy his final hours on the stolen throne. I knew Cameron was frantically finalizing his paperwork and packing his designer suitcases for his long, lavish trip to the Amalfi Coast. I knew Rachel was likely bragging to more friends about her brilliant business acumen and her newfound massive wealth. They were living in a beautiful glass bubble of their own creation, completely blind to the reality closing in around them. They thought they had successfully erased me from the narrative of my own life. But Friday morning was coming incredibly fast. I was no longer the helpless old man they remembered. I was holding the hammer that was going to shatter their entire world into a million tiny pieces. Friday morning broke with a cold, brilliant sunlight that seemed to perfectly illuminate the massive crime about to take place. The air was crisp and completely still. At exactly 7:30 in the morning, Cameron Davis walked out of the glass front doors of Pierce Packaging Solutions and stood at the top of the concrete steps. He did not look like a man who was about to illegally dismantle a 40-year-old manufacturing empire. He looked like a conqueror surveying his newly acquired kingdom. He was wearing a light gray tailored suit that caught the morning light perfectly. A heavy silver watch gleamed on his left wrist, and in his right hand, he held a sleek leather clipboard containing the forged operating documents and the signed founder rights waiver I had handed him at the country club. He took a deep breath of the cold air and smiled. In his mind, the war was already completely over. He had neutralized the stubborn old founder. He had purged the factory of any loyal employees who might have asked dangerous questions. He had successfully transferred $2 million of stolen operating capital into an untraceable offshore account. Now all he had to do was stand aside and let the corporate liquidators tear the copper and steel out of the building. Once the $4 million wire transfer cleared at noon, he would be on a first-class flight to Europe. Cameron pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed his wife. Rachel answered on the second ring. I could practically hear the arrogant excitement in her voice even from a distance. She told him the designer luggage was already packed and waiting by the front door of their house. She asked him if the old man had tried to cause any last-minute problems. Cameron laughed, a loud, echoing sound that rolled across the empty parking lot. He told her that I was completely broken. He bragged about how easily I had surrendered for a pathetic $50,000 check. He assured her that the private security guards were posted at the perimeter and that the liquidators were already pulling off the highway. They said their goodbyes, exchanging promises of champagne and Italian villas. Cameron slipped the phone back into his tailored jacket just as the low, heavy rumble of diesel engines began to shake the ground. A convoy of massive flatbed transport trucks turned onto Industrial Avenue. There were 6 of them in total, painted in a stark industrial yellow, with the black logo of Apex Asset Management stamped across their doors. They moved like a line of mechanical vultures descending on a fresh kill. The air brakes hissed loudly as the lead truck pulled up to the main security gate. Cameron walked down the concrete steps with a confident, predatory stride. He gestured for the newly hired private security guards to open the heavy iron gates. The trucks rolled onto the property, their massive tires crushing the gravel. Behind the trucks, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled into the lot. The lead liquidator stepped out of the vehicle. He was a tall, imposing man wearing a dark trench coat. He carried a thick metal briefcase containing the final acquisition contracts. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," the liquidator said, extending a hand. "I see you have the facility completely secured and prepped for the extraction. We brought enough heavy lifting equipment to clear the primary assembly machines by noon, just as we agreed." Cameron shook the man's hand vigorously. "Everything is exactly as we discussed," he replied, tapping his leather clipboard. "The floor is entirely clear of non-essential personnel. I have a crew of temporary laborers waiting by the loading docks to assist your team with the dismantling process. The title transfer documents and the final executive waivers are all signed and ready for your review. We can begin the physical extraction immediately." The liquidator nodded, looking past Cameron to the massive corrugated steel building. "It is a very impressive facility, Mr. Davis. You are leaving a lot of money on the table by liquidating the heavy machinery so quickly. These automated assembly lines are highly specialized." Cameron smiled, his teeth completely white against the cold morning air. "I am not interested in the slow grind of the manufacturing sector," he said, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance. "I am an architect of capital. I am streamlining the portfolio. Just get the machines on the trucks and initiate the wire transfer." He turned around and looked at the factory. This was the absolute peak of his false empire. He stood in the center of the sprawling 10-acre lot, surrounded by heavy machinery and hired muscle. He truly believed he possessed the intelligence and the ruthlessness to steal 40 years of my blood and sweat without a single consequence. He looked at the painted letters of my name on the side of the building, and he saw nothing but dollar signs. He was completely intoxicated by the illusion of his own supreme power. The liquidator signaled to his foreman. The doors of the heavy transport trucks swung open, and dozens of men in hard hats began pouring out carrying heavy chains, pneumatic tools, and steel cables. The temporary workers Cameron had hired began rolling up the massive bay doors at the rear of the facility, exposing the silent millions of dollars worth of patented machinery sitting on the factory floor. The stage was perfectly set for the final act of the robbery. Cameron stood with his hands on his hips, watching the army of workers begin to swarm the building. He checked his heavy silver watch. It was almost 8 o'clock. The timeline was holding perfectly. He took out his pen and prepared to sign the final authorization forms on his clipboard. But before the pen could even touch the paper, a new sound interrupted the organized chaos of the liquidation crew. It was not the heavy rumble of a commercial transport truck. It was the distinct sputtering roar of an old V8 engine. The sound echoed down Industrial Avenue, growing louder and more aggressive by the second. Cameron stopped smiling. He lowered his clipboard and turned his head toward the main entrance. The private security guards stepped forward, placing their hands on their radios. The liquidator paused mid-step, looking toward the noise with a puzzled expression. Coming down the street, ignoring the speed limit entirely, was my battered blue Ford truck. I was not driving like a defeated old man. I was driving like a battering ram. The false empire had enjoyed its final sunrise. The silent adjustment was over. The loud collision of consequence had officially arrived. The rusted blue hood of my Ford truck broke through the morning mist like a battering ram. I did not slow down as I approached the main security checkpoint. The 2 private guards Cameron had hired jumped back in panic, dropping their radios as I slammed the heavy vehicle into a hard horizontal slide. The thick tires grabbed the asphalt, screaming in protest until the truck came to a complete stop directly across the primary exit lane. I had perfectly wedged the massive steel frame between the brick security kiosk and the reinforced concrete pillar of the front gate. Nothing larger than a bicycle was getting onto or off of that property. I killed the ignition. The sudden silence that fell over the parking lot was heavier than the rumble of the engines. I opened the heavy steel door and stepped out onto the pavement. The visual contrast was immediate and entirely intentional. I was wearing my thick canvas work coat and the scuffed leather boots that had walked every square inch of that factory floor for 4 decades. I looked exactly like the foundation of the company, a rusted, scarred, immovable object. Across the lot, standing in front of the sleek black luxury sedan and the fleet of pristine yellow transport trucks, stood the thieves. Cameron in his $3,000 tailored gray suit and the corporate liquidator in his expensive dark trench coat. They looked like polished parasites, completely out of place against the raw industrial backdrop. Cameron lost his perfect conqueror smile instantly. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very young. His carefully constructed illusion of total control was physically blocked by a piece of American steel that he could not simply delete from a spreadsheet. He recovered quickly, replacing his shock with a mask of manufactured fury. He marched across the parking lot toward me, his expensive leather shoes clicking rapidly against the asphalt. The 2 security guards trailed cautiously behind him, unsure of how to handle the situation. "What in the absolute hell are you doing, Warren?" Cameron shouted, his voice cracking slightly with panic. He was acutely aware that the liquidator was watching his every move. "I told you that you were no longer welcome on this property. You signed the founder rights waiver on Tuesday night. You took the buyout check. You have zero legal authority to be standing here. Move this piece of garbage truck out of the gate right now, or I will have these guards physically drag you off the lot and press charges for criminal trespassing. I did not move. I leaned back against the cold, rusted fender of my truck and crossed my arms. I did not even look at Cameron. I looked directly past him at the tall man in the dark trench coat who was still standing by the black sedan. "You must be the man from Apex Asset Management," I called out, projecting my voice clearly across the lot so every single temporary worker and truck driver could hear me. "I hope Cameron told you that the machinery you are about to load onto your trucks is fully protected by 37 active federal patents." The liquidator stiffened. He turned his head and glared at Cameron. Corporate vultures were perfectly happy to buy distressed assets, but they were terrified of intellectual property litigation. Cameron stopped marching and spun around, looking back at the liquidator, holding up his hands in a defensive gesture. "Do not listen to him," Cameron yelled, pointing a shaking finger back at me. "He is a confused old man. He is suffering from a massive cognitive decline due to a heart condition. I have the medical power of attorney and the fully executed waiver right here on this clipboard. The title is completely clean. He is just having a sentimental breakdown." The liquidator did not look convinced. He closed his thick metal briefcase with a loud snap and took a step forward. An angry founder was one thing. A founder screaming about federal patents in front of a dozen witnesses was a massive liability. The liquidator looked at my calm, steady posture and then looked at Cameron, who was sweating through his expensive, tailored suit despite the freezing morning temperature. Cameron realized he was losing control of the narrative. He turned his aggression entirely back onto me. "Remove him!" Cameron screamed at the two security guards. "Drag him away from the vehicle and call the police. He is trespassing on private corporate property." The two guards stepped forward, but they hesitated. I looked the first guard directly in the eyes. "I know you earn $20 an hour," I said, my voice low and completely devoid of fear. "I also know that if you lay a single finger on me, you will be named as an active accomplice in a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud investigation. Do you really want to go to federal prison for a man who is going to be on a plane to Italy by noon?" The guard swallowed hard and took a slow, deliberate step backward. He lowered his hands and looked at the ground. He was not paid enough to tangle with an old man who spoke with that level of terrifying certainty. Cameron was breathing heavily now. His chest heaved under the gray suit. He realized physical force was no longer an option. He walked right up to my truck, stopping mere inches from me. "You are bluffing," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper so the liquidator could not hear. "You have nothing. I own the management company. I control the bank accounts. I have your signature on the waiver. You are just a bitter old ghost trying to haunt a building you do not own anymore." I looked down at him. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. "I do not need to bluff, Cameron," I said softly. "I just needed you to lock the door behind yourself." Before Cameron could comprehend the meaning of my words, a new sound cut through the cold morning air. It was the synchronized hum of high-performance engines. Moving steadily down Industrial Avenue, approaching the blockade I had created, were three identical black government sedans. They pulled up smoothly behind my battered Ford truck, boxing in the entire false empire. The corporate liquidator took one look at the federal license plates on the sedans and immediately dropped his clipboard onto the pavement. The real authorities had arrived, and Cameron was finally out of time. The morning air was already incredibly tense, but the arrival of the three identical black sedans shattered whatever fragile control Cameron thought he maintained over the situation. They did not rush into the parking lot, with sirens blaring or tires screeching. They moved with the terrifying and synchronized precision of a predator that had already cornered its prey. The vehicles pulled up in a tight, flawless formation, forming an impenetrable wall of dark steel and tinted glass directly behind my rusted truck. The heavy diesel engines of the yellow transport trucks seemed to quiet down as the drivers instinctively killed their ignitions. The temporary warehouse workers standing by the open bay doors stopped moving entirely. The entire factory lot fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. The doors of the lead sedan opened simultaneously. Anthony Russo stepped out of the passenger side. He was wearing a dark charcoal wool overcoat and carrying a single heavy leather folder. He did not look like a corporate lawyer arriving for a standard contract dispute. He looked like an executioner stepping onto the gallows. From the other doors and the trailing vehicles, 3 men emerged onto the cold asphalt. They were physically imposing, wearing dark suits and tactical windbreakers. The bold yellow letters printed across the back of their jackets identified them immediately to everyone in the lot. They were federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. The shift in the atmosphere was absolute and instantaneous. This was no longer a family disagreement over a business transition or a civil dispute about a lock on a door. This was the active scene of a major federal crime. The tall liquidator from Apex Asset Management took one look at the federal windbreakers, and the color completely drained from his face. Men in his profession survived by strictly avoiding legal liabilities and government scrutiny. Buying a distressed company for scrap was highly profitable, but buying stolen intellectual property under the direct watch of federal agents was a career death sentence. He immediately took 3 large steps away from Cameron, physically distancing himself from the toxic center of the fraud. He gripped his metal briefcase so tightly his knuckles turned white, and he looked toward his foreman standing near the yellow trucks. He gave them a sharp, subtle shake of his head. The message was perfectly clear. Do not touch a single machine on that floor. Cameron was staring at the black sedans with his mouth slightly open. His brain was desperately trying to process how his perfect morning had suddenly turned into a federal raid. He looked at me, his eyes darting frantically, looking for an explanation that fit his arrogant and entitled worldview. When he found none, he fell back on his forged authority. He raised his leather clipboard, holding it up in front of his chest, like a pathetic plastic shield against an incoming storm. Anthony, what are you doing here? Cameron demanded, his voice shaking so badly it cracked on the final word. You have no legal standing in this transaction. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Pierce Packaging Solutions. I hold the comprehensive medical power of attorney. I have a signed waiver from Warren relinquishing all his founder rights and approving this exact transaction. I am conducting a lawful sale of corporate assets. Get these government men off my property right now before I sue your entire firm for tortious interference. Anthony did not even blink at the threat. He walked slowly past my rusted truck, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the asphalt, and stopped 10 feet away from Cameron. He looked at the younger man with an expression of pure professional disgust. You do not own this property, Cameron, Anthony said, his voice cold and loud enough to echo off the corrugated steel walls of the factory. You do not own a single machine sitting on that concrete floor, and you certainly do not have the legal authority to sell them to a third-party liquidator. Cameron pointed frantically at the clipboard. I have the power of attorney, he screamed, the panic finally breaking through his tailored, sophisticated facade. I control the operating company. I control the bank accounts. I fired the staff. It is mine. You control a management shell, Anthony replied smoothly, opening his leather folder and pulling out the thick documents we had prepared. You control an entity that pays the water bill and the employee salaries, but you were so blinded by the cash in the accounts that you never bothered to check who actually owns the building you are standing in. Pierce Packaging Solutions only leases this facility and the proprietary equipment inside it. The 10 acres of commercial real estate and the 37 federal patents attached to those assembly lines are owned entirely by the Martha Pierce Irrevocable Trust. Warren is the sole trustee. The liquidator let out a sharp, vicious curse. He turned to Cameron, his face twisted in absolute fury. You told me the title was entirely clean, he shouted at Cameron, his voice carrying across the silent lot. You explicitly guaranteed that the operating company held the physical deeds to the property and the machines. You tried to sell me stolen intellectual property while federal agents were building a case against you. Our deal is completely terminated, Davis. Do not ever contact my firm again. The liquidator did not wait for an apology or an explanation. He turned his back on Cameron, walked briskly to his black luxury sedan, and climbed inside. He started the engine and reversed aggressively out of the parking lot, leaving Cameron standing completely alone in the center of his rapidly collapsing empire. Cameron watched the liquidator drive away, his chest heaving heavily as he struggled to draw air into his lungs. He looked at the waiver clipped to his board. He thought about the $50,000 check he had smugly thrown into my lap. The massive architectural trap I had laid for him was finally visible, but it was far too late for him to step out of it. But I have the waiver, Cameron whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying realization. He looked at me, his eyes wide with desperate confusion. You signed it, Warren. You legally transferred the liability. You gave me the right to execute the sale. You took the money. Anthony stepped forward, closing the distance between them. That waiver is exactly why these federal agents are standing here today, Anthony explained, his tone completely devoid of mercy. We knew you were siphoning the operating cash into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. We knew you were generating fraudulent consulting invoices to bleed the company dry over the last month. But you were hiding behind the medical power of attorney, claiming you were simply making poor executive decisions on behalf of the board. We needed you to isolate yourself legally. We needed you to explicitly claim sole ownership of the fraudulent debt structure you created. Anthony pointed a long finger at the clipboard in Cameron's shaking hand. When you forced Warren to sign that waiver last night, you formally stated to the federal government that you alone were responsible for the asset sale. You formally accepted all financial liability to clear the title. You thought you were building a shield to protect yourself from future lawsuits, but you actually signed a full legal confession. You admitted to federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and the attempted sale of stolen corporate assets. The lead federal agent stepped forward from the line of black sedans. He was a broad-shouldered man with cold, observant eyes who had spent his entire career dismantling white-collar criminals. He did not yell or raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, heavy, and absolute authority of the United States government. He addressed Cameron directly, asking him to confirm his legal identity. Cameron could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The expensive, tailored gray suit suddenly looked entirely too large for his shrinking, defeated frame. The heavy silver watch on his wrist felt like an iron shackle pulling him down toward the concrete. He dropped the leather clipboard onto the asphalt. It hit the ground with a sharp crack, and the signed waiver fluttered slightly in the cold morning breeze. The federal agent reached into the pocket of his tactical windbreaker and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clink of the chain was the only sound left in the world. The false empire was completely gone. The illusion of wealth, power, and superiority had evaporated into the freezing air, leaving nothing but the cold, hard reality of a federal prison sentence. And back at the lavish house on the hill, Rachel was still waiting eagerly by the front door, with her designer luggage, completely unaware that the vacation was permanently canceled and the nightmare was just beginning. The freezing wind whipped across the parking lot, but Cameron was sweating profusely. He saw my rusted truck blocking the gate and the dark sedans idling behind it, but his mind completely rejected the reality of the situation. He was too close to his massive payday to let a traffic jam stop him. He grabbed the sleeve of the corporate liquidator and practically dragged the tall man away from the vehicles and toward the open bay doors of the massive facility. Cameron knew that if he could just get the signature on the final contract and initiate the $4 million wire transfer, the machines would legally belong to Apex Asset Management. He thought the legal paperwork would protect him from whatever chaos was brewing outside. I stepped away from my truck and followed them at a slow, deliberate pace. Anthony Russo and the 3 federal agents fell in line right beside me. We did not run. We did not shout. We simply walked into the building to watch a man hang himself. The main production floor of Pierce Packaging Solutions was a cavernous space built from reinforced concrete and steel beams. It smelled heavily of machine oil, diesel fuel, and the faint metallic scent of hot copper. For 40 years, this room had been a deafening symphony of industry. Today, it was completely silent. The temporary warehouse workers Cameron had hired were standing nervously by the loading docks, unsure of what to do. The massive automated assembly lines sat dead and cold. These were not just pieces of metal. These were the highly specialized pneumatic folders and robotic packaging arms I had spent decades designing and patenting. They were the mechanical beating heart of my legacy. Cameron walked right past them without a second glance. He did not see the engineering brilliance. He only saw scrap metal that he could trade for a luxury vacation and a sports car. Cameron led the liquidator to the center of the production floor, stopping next to the primary control console of the largest assembly machine. The liquidator looked extremely uncomfortable. The arrival of the black sedans outside had triggered his professional survival instincts, but his greed kept him anchored to the spot. Buying $15 million worth of industrial equipment for a fraction of the cost was a career-defining acquisition. He set his heavy metal briefcase down on the flat steel surface of the control console. The loud clack of the briefcase latches echoed through the empty factory. The liquidator opened the case and pulled out a thick stack of acquisition contracts. He looked at Cameron with cold, calculating eyes. He stated very clearly that his firm was ready to initiate the immediate transfer of $4 million in liquid funds. But he made it absolutely mandatory that Cameron provide the physical proof of ownership before a single penny moved. The liquidator demanded to see the clean title to the commercial real estate, the intellectual property release forms for the machinery, and the formal corporate resolution authorizing the emergency sale. He told Cameron that any discrepancy in the paperwork would immediately terminate the deal. Cameron did not hesitate. His arrogance completely blinded him to the massive legal snare waiting beneath his feet. He opened his leather clipboard and presented the forged operating documents. He laid them out on the steel console one by one, smoothing the edges with his manicured hands. He presented the medical power of attorney, claiming it gave him total and unquestionable executive control over the entire enterprise. He presented a fraudulent balance sheet showing the company was drowning in insurmountable debt, justifying the rapid liquidation. And finally, with a smug, triumphant smile, he presented the founder rights waiver I had signed the night before at the country club. "Look at the signature," Cameron said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet, cavernous room. Warren Pierce formally relinquished all remaining rights to this facility and these assets last night. He accepted a buyout check and waived his ability to interfere with this transaction. I am the sole legal authority representing Pierce Packaging Solutions. The title is completely clean, and the board of directors has fully authorized this asset transfer. I stood in the shadows near the loading bay doors, standing shoulder to shoulder with Anthony Russo and the federal agents. We watched the entire exchange in perfect silence. The lead federal agent had a small digital audio recorder resting in the palm of his hand, capturing every single word Cameron said. Cameron was verbally confirming his total ownership of the fraudulent scheme. He was stating for the official legal record that he alone was responsible for the documents resting on the steel table. The liquidator picked up the waiver and examined my jagged, forced signature. He compared it to the corporate filings. He looked at the medical power of attorney. To a corporate vulture looking for a quick kill, the paperwork appeared completely legitimate. The liquidator nodded slowly. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek silver laptop. He opened the screen and connected it to a secure mobile banking portal. The bright glow of the monitor illuminated Cameron's eager and desperate face. "I need the routing information for the receiving account," the liquidator said, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Where is the $4 million purchase price going, Mr. Davis?" Cameron reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small white card. He read the numbers aloud. It was the exact routing sequence for the anonymous offshore holding company in the Cayman Islands. It was the exact same account he had used to drain the $2 million operating fund earlier that week. He was instructing a third-party buyer to send funds derived from the sale of corporate assets directly into a private, untraceable account. The liquidator typed the numbers into the banking portal. He verified the routing sequence and the receiving bank. He turned the laptop screen toward Cameron. The digital display showed a pending wire transfer for $4 million. At the bottom of the screen was a final digital authorization box requiring the signature of the selling party. Sign here to finalize the transfer of the property title and the equipment. Deeds the liquidator instructed, pointing a heavy silver pen at the digital pad. Once you sign, the funds will be released, and my crew will begin dismantling the floor. Cameron took the silver pen. He did not look around the room. He did not notice the temporary workers backing away toward the exits. He did not notice the tall shadows stepping out from behind the heavy machinery. He was completely consumed by the glowing numbers on the screen. He saw his future, his wealth, and his freedom waiting just behind that digital signature line. He pressed the tip of the pen against the screen and rapidly signed his name. The second the digital ink dried, Cameron Davis officially crossed the absolute legal threshold of a major federal crime. He had not just planned a theft. He had executed it. He had presented forged documents to a commercial buyer. He had fraudulently represented the ownership of a 10-acre commercial property. He had attempted to sell 37 federal patents that he did not own. And he had utilized an electronic banking network to facilitate the transfer of stolen funds across international borders. He had committed grand larceny, corporate fraud, and federal wire fraud, all within the span of 5 minutes, and he had done it in front of multiple witnesses, including 3 federal agents. Cameron let out a massive sigh of relief. He dropped the pen onto the console and buttoned his suit jacket. He looked at the liquidator with a wide, arrogant grin. "The deal is done," Cameron said, his voice dripping with supreme confidence. "You can tell your men to start cutting the bolts on the machines. I want this floor completely stripped by sunset." The liquidator reached forward to close his laptop. But before his hand could touch the screen, a heavy leather folder landed directly on top of the keyboard with a loud, violent smack. Cameron jumped backward, startled by the sudden noise. He spun around. His arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Anthony Russo was standing directly beside the control console. He had moved across the factory floor with the silent, terrifying speed of a seasoned predator. His face was a mask of cold, absolute professional fury. He placed his hand flat on the heavy green leather folder, bearing the gold letters of the Martha Pierce Irrevocable Trust. Right behind Anthony, standing in a perfect, unbroken line, were the 3 federal agents. The bold yellow letters on their dark windbreakers stood out violently against the gray machinery. And standing right next to them, bathed in the cold morning light, filtering through the high factory windows, was me. I was not leaning on a cane. I was not trembling. I stood tall and completely immovable, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had tried to erase my legacy. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had completely crushed him. Cameron looked at the federal agents, then at Anthony, then finally at me. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost haunting his own execution. The false emperor had just sold a kingdom he never owned, and the real king had brought the entire United States government to collect the debt. Anthony did not raise his voice, but the absolute authority in his tone commanded the massive, cavernous room. He stepped directly up to the steel control console, pushing Cameron slightly to the side with his shoulder. He opened the heavy green leather folder. The gold lettering on the cover seemed to catch the cold morning light filtering through the high windows. Anthony pulled out the original documents of the Martha Pierce Irrevocable Trust. The papers were thick, heavy, and bordered with official state seals. He laid them directly on top of the fraudulent balance sheets Cameron had just proudly displayed to the room. "Read these very carefully," Anthony instructed, looking directly at the liquidator. "You are a man who buys and sells commercial property for a living. You know exactly what a master lease agreement looks like. Look at the names on the deeds." The liquidator leaned over the steel console. His eyes scanned the first page of the trust document. The silence in the factory was so profound that I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent security lights far above us. I watched the liquidator trace his finger down the list of assets legally bound to the trust. His finger moved over the strict legal descriptions of the 10 acres of prime commercial real estate. It moved over the 37 registered federal patents for the automated assembly lines resting quietly around us. It stopped at the bottom of the page where my signature and Martha's signature rested permanently under the raised seal of a notary public. "This is an ironclad private trust," the liquidator whispered, his voice tight with sudden intense panic. "The operating company does not own a single piece of this facility. They are nothing but a month-to-month tenant." "Exactly," Anthony said, his voice as sharp as a surgical scalpel. "Cameron Davis is merely the manager of a tenant organization. He just attempted to sell you the building he rents using a fabricated medical power of attorney. He also attempted to sell you proprietary machinery that is protected by federal intellectual property laws. If you had finalized that wire transfer, your firm would be in possession of stolen property. The federal government would have seized every single machine, and Apex Asset Management would be indicted for participating in a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud syndicate." The liquidator ripped his silver laptop away from Cameron so fast, the power cord snapped and sparked against the metal console. He slammed the screen shut, severing the digital connection to the banking portal instantly. The pending $4 million wire transfer vanished into the dark monitor. The liquidator turned his entire body toward Cameron. The professional courtesy he had shown in the parking lot was completely gone. It was replaced by the vicious, unhinged anger of a predator that had just been tricked into walking directly onto a legal minefield. "You lied to me," the liquidator shouted, his voice echoing violently off the concrete walls. "You sat in my office in Chicago and looked me directly in the eye and guaranteed that the title was clear. You presented forged executive summaries to my legal team. You tried to make me an unwitting accomplice to federal grand larceny, while federal agents were standing right outside the door." Cameron held his hands up, his palms sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically between the furious liquidator and the cold federal agents standing nearby. "I did not know," Cameron stammered, taking a weak, stumbling step backward. "I thought the operating company held the physical assets. I thought the power of attorney gave me the absolute right to restructure the physical debt. I did not know about the private trust." "Ignorance is not a legal defense," Anthony stated, completely destroying Cameron's pathetic attempt at an excuse. "And it is certainly not a defense when you intentionally drain $2 million from the payroll accounts to create a fake insolvency. You knew exactly what you were doing, Cameron. You just did not bother to check who actually owned the chessboard before you tried to steal the pieces." The liquidator grabbed his metal briefcase. He shoved his laptop inside and locked the latches with a violent, loud snap. "I am formally terminating the acquisition agreement, effective immediately," the liquidator declared, pointing a heavy, shaking finger directly at Cameron's chest. "But this does not end here, Davis. You signed a binding letter of intent with my firm. You legally guaranteed the delivery of these commercial assets, because you completely misrepresented your legal authority and wasted my time and resources. Apex Asset Management is going to file a massive civil lawsuit against your personal holding company. We are going to sue you for breach of contract fraud and punitive damages. We will take every single dollar you have hidden away." Cameron's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the edge of the steel control console to keep himself from collapsing onto the concrete floor. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him with the devastating weight of a falling building. The $4 million payday was permanently gone. The $2 million he had stolen was currently being tracked and frozen by the federal task force. He was about to be sued into absolute poverty by a ruthless corporate liquidation firm, and the federal agents were still standing right there waiting to put him in heavy steel handcuffs. He looked at me. For the first time in a month, the arrogant sneer was completely erased from his face. He looked like a terrified little boy who had broken something he could not afford to fix. He opened his mouth to speak. He wanted to beg. He wanted to ask the confused old man he had mocked and humiliated to somehow fix the massive catastrophe he had brought upon himself. He wanted me to tell the federal agents it was all just a big family misunderstanding that could be resolved privately. But I offered him absolutely nothing. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at him with the cold, detached expression of a man watching a stranger face the inevitable consequences of his own terrible choices. I had built this factory to feed my family. I had built the trust to protect my daughter. Cameron had tried to burn it all down for a sports car and a luxury vacation. He had locked me out of my own life. Now the heavy steel doors were closing on his. The liquidator did not wait for Cameron to speak another word. He picked up his briefcase and marched rapidly across the factory floor. He shouted at his foreman, telling them to get the crews back into the transport trucks immediately. The yellow trucks started their heavy diesel engines, filling the air with the smell of exhaust. They backed out of the loading bays and drove away as fast as they could, desperate to escape the blast radius of the active federal investigation. The massive factory was quiet again. The temporary workers had completely vanished. The corporate liquidators were gone. There was no one left on the floor except the federal agents Anthony, myself, and the broken man who had thrown away his entire future. The legal trap had sprung perfectly. The unveiling of the truth was absolute and undeniable. Now there was only one final step remaining. The lead federal agent stepped away from the steel control console and moved directly toward Cameron. He did not rush or shout. He moved with the practiced absolute calm of a man who had performed this exact sequence 1,000 times before. He stated his name and his rank within the Financial Crimes Division. He informed Cameron Davis that he was officially under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and the attempted sale of stolen corporate assets. Cameron tried to take another step backward, but his legs finally gave out completely under the crushing weight of reality. He hit the concrete floor hard, tearing the fabric of his $3,000 tailored gray suit at the knee. He looked up at the federal agent with eyes wide with absolute unadulterated terror. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving violently as if he were drowning in the middle of the empty factory. "Stand up, Mr. Davis," the agent commanded, his voice flat and completely devoid of any sympathy. When Cameron could not find the physical strength to lift himself, the other two federal agents stepped forward. They grabbed him firmly by the arms of his expensive jacket and hauled him to his feet. The metallic sound of the heavy handcuffs clicking into place echoed loudly against the corrugated steel walls. Cameron's wrists were pulled tightly behind his back. He looked down at the cold steel binding his hands, and a pathetic, hollow, whimpering sound escaped his throat. The false conqueror had been reduced to a trembling, broken criminal in less than 60 seconds. Anthony Russo watched the arrest with cold, professional satisfaction. I watched it with a profound sense of finality. This was the exact consequence I had meticulously engineered. The agents began to read Cameron his rights, reciting the familiar legal warning about his right to remain silent smoothly from memory. It was a right he should have exercised weeks ago when he first decided to steal my empire. Just as the federal agents turned Cameron around to march him toward the black government sedans waiting in the parking lot, the heavy glass doors at the front of the factory swung open. The sound of frantic clicking heels echoed rapidly down the main hallway leading to the production floor. Rachel burst into the cavernous room. She was wearing a stunning designer trench coat over her traveling clothes, and she was holding a pair of expensive sunglasses in her manicured hand. The scent of her imported perfume clashed violently with the smell of heavy machine oil and diesel fuel. She had grown tired of waiting by the front door of their lavish house. She had driven her new company-funded sports car to the factory, expecting to find her husband holding a wire transfer receipt for $4 million so they could leave for the airport. Instead, she walked directly into a living nightmare. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the dark federal windbreakers. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in the sight of Anthony Russo standing calmly by the control console and me standing quietly in the shadows. Then she saw Cameron. He was being escorted by two federal agents, his hands securely cuffed behind his back, his expensive suit wrinkled and dirty from the factory floor. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very small. "Cameron!" She screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly across the massive room. "What is happening? Who are these men?" She ran forward, attempting to reach her husband, but the lead federal agent stepped firmly into her path, holding up a broad hand to stop her advance. "Mom, you need to step back," the agent instructed firmly. "This is an active federal crime scene, and the suspect is currently in federal custody." Rachel looked at the agent as if he were speaking a foreign language. "Suspect," she repeated, her voice trembling with rising panic. "He is the chief executive officer of this company. He is selling the equipment today. You cannot arrest him. We have a flight to Italy in 3 hours." The federal agent did not even blink at her wealthy entitlement. "He is not going to Italy, Mom," the agent replied smoothly. "He is going to a federal detention center to await arraignment for multiple felony fraud charges." Rachel watched the agents lead her sobbing husband out the heavy loading bay doors and into the freezing morning air. The heavy metal doors of the black sedan slammed shut, severing Cameron from the outside world completely. Rachel turned around slowly. Her eyes locked onto me. The arrogant condescension she had displayed at the country club was completely, entirely gone. She was trembling uncontrollably, her designer trench coat looking entirely out of place and foolish in the cold industrial setting. She ran across the concrete floor, the sharp clicking of her heels sounding like a desperate, frantic heartbeat. She stopped a few feet away from me, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, ruining her expensive cosmetics. "Dad," she pleaded, her voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "Dad, please tell them to stop. This is a massive misunderstanding. You have to call them off. You have to tell them Cameron had your permission. We are family. You cannot let them take him away." I looked at my daughter. I looked at the woman who had happily stolen my life work so she could buy diamond necklaces and take luxury vacations. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep well of parental forgiveness had completely run dry the moment she told her friends I was a confused burden who belonged in a nursing home. I did not call them Rachel, I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. Cameron called them himself when he tried to sell a 10-acre property he did not legally own. He stole $2 million from the operating accounts. He forged consulting invoices. He committed massive federal crimes, and he left a permanent paper trail leading directly to his own front door. He is facing 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Rachel shook her head violently, refusing to accept the reality of the situation. "No," she sobbed, reaching out to grab the sleeve of my canvas work coat. "We did it for us. We did it to secure the future. You have to pay for a lawyer, Dad. You have to bail him out. You have so much money in the trust. You can fix this. You always fix everything. Please, Daddy, do not let them ruin our lives." I gently but firmly pulled my arm out of her grasp. I took a deliberate step back, creating a clear physical boundary between us. "I am not going to fix this, Rachel," I told her, my voice echoing coldly off the steel walls. "And I am certainly not going to use the trust fund to bail out the man who tried to bankrupt the people who work in this building. But you are going to need a very good lawyer for yourself." Rachel froze. The tears stopped flowing. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a new, much deeper terror. "Why do I need a lawyer? I did not do anything. I was just letting Cameron handle the business." Anthony Russo stepped forward, opening his heavy green leather folder once again. He pulled out the corporate registry filings for the offshore shell companies Cameron had created to siphon the operating cash. He held the documents out so Rachel could see the signature lines. "You did not just let him handle the business," Rachel, Anthony said, his tone strictly professional and completely merciless. "Cameron needed a secondary officer to legally establish the holding companies in the Cayman Islands. He could not do it alone without triggering immediate international banking flags. You signed as the co-director of the offshore entities. You also signed the fraudulent bonus authorizations that drained the payroll accounts. Rachel stared at her own looping signature on the copied documents. She had signed them blindly, trusting her husband, trusting the promise of endless wealth without ever reading the fine print. "But I did not know they were fake," she cried out, her voice desperate and thin. "I just signed where he told me to sign. I am his wife. I did not commit fraud." "Ignorance of the crime does not erase your participation in it," I told her, stepping forward so she had to look me directly in the eyes. "By signing those documents, you became an active legal conspirator in the theft of $2 million. The federal agents have copies of everything. They are going to freeze your personal bank accounts by noon today. They are going to seize the lavish house you live in, the sports car you drove here in, and every single piece of jewelry Cameron bought with stolen money. You are going to be indicted, Rachel. All of your wealthy friends at the country club are going to watch you stand trial." Rachel stumbled backward, as if I had physically struck her. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, a look of absolute devastation washing over her features. She realized in that exact moment that her beautiful, comfortable, protected life was completely over. She would have to find a cheap apartment. She would have to find a minimum wage job. She was entirely ruined. "But the most tragic part of this entire situation, Rachel," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, steady cadence, "is that you burned down your own castle just to steal the silverware. When your mother and I built this company, we put the real estate and the patents into an irrevocable trust. We did it to protect the legacy from corporate raiders. We did it to ensure that you would always be taken care of. You were the sole beneficiary of the Martha Pierce Irrevocable Trust. The moment I died, you would have legally inherited the 10 acres of commercial land, the $15 million in proprietary machinery, and the massive licensing revenue they generated every single year. You were already a multi-millionaire, Rachel. You just had to be patient. You just had to love your father." Rachel let out a loud, agonizing wail. She fell to her knees on the cold concrete floor, covering her face with her hands. The sound of her weeping echoed through the empty factory, but I felt no urge to comfort her. "You chose to treat me like an expiring resource," I said, looking down at her trembling form. "You chose to mock me and cast me aside. You actively conspired to defraud the very trust that was built to protect you. And because you participated in a fraudulent attack against the trust assets, you triggered the strict penalty clause your mother and I established decades ago. Any beneficiary who attempts to steal from the trust automatically and permanently forfeits their inheritance." Rachel looked up at me, her makeup smeared, her eyes completely broken. She realized the absolute magnitude of her mistake. She had traded an unbreakable financial fortress for a few weeks of stolen luxury. "You have nothing left, Rachel," I told her, delivering the final, absolute truth. "Your husband is going to federal prison. The government is going to take your house and your car. And the massive inheritance your mother and I spent 40 years building for you is legally and permanently gone. I am removing you as the beneficiary this afternoon. I suggest you call a public defender." I turned my back on my weeping daughter. I did not look back as I walked across the factory floor, leaving her completely alone in the cold, empty space she had tried to destroy. The red and blue lights of the federal vehicles flashed silently in the bright morning sun as they backed out of the factory parking lot. I stood on the cold concrete and watched them turn onto Industrial Avenue, carrying Cameron away to a future he had entirely built for himself. The heavy iron gates remained open, but the oppressive weight that had hung over the property for the last month was completely gone. Rachel was still weeping on the factory floor inside, but I did not go back in to comfort her. Anthony Russo stayed behind to coordinate with the local authorities regarding her vehicle and her immediate legal status. I turned my attention away from the wreckage of their lives and focused on the only thing that actually mattered now. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and dialed a number I had known by heart for 30 years. Thomas answered on the first ring. I told him the liquidation was canceled and the false executives were no longer on the property. I told him to grab his heavy-duty power drill and come back to the place where he belonged. Less than 20 minutes later, Thomas pulled his rusted sedan into his rightful parking spot near the loading docks. He walked up the concrete steps holding his industrial drill and a heavy steel bit. He did not ask any unnecessary questions because he saw the deep calm resting on my face. He looked at the gleaming chrome lock that Cameron had installed to keep me out of my own life. Thomas raised the drill and pressed the steel bit directly into the center of the shiny metal. The loud grinding noise of metal tearing into metal echoed across the empty lot. It took less than 3 minutes for the expensive lock to completely shatter. Thomas pulled the ruined cylinder out of the doorframe and tossed it into the nearest garbage can. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key. The edges were worn smooth from decades of hard work and honest labor. I slid the key into the empty cavity of the door mechanism where it belonged. I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped back into my empire. The front reception area was exactly as I had left it before my heart surgery. I walked past the empty front desk and headed straight for the main production floor. By the time I reached the massive assembly lines, my loyal employees had already begun to return. Sarah from accounting walked in through the front doors, carrying her familiar leather briefcase. David from quality control arrived a few minutes later, shaking his head in disbelief as Thomas explained what had happened. Within an hour, the parking lot was full again. I stood at the center of the floor and looked at the faces of the people who had built this legacy alongside me. I told them that every single person Cameron had fired was immediately reinstated with a full month of back pay and a permanent raise. I told them that the factory was safe and the machines were never leaving this building. Thomas walked over to the primary control console where Cameron had just tried to sell our future. He looked at me for final confirmation. I gave him a single firm nod. Thomas reached out and engaged the main power switch. The deep mechanical hum started low and built rapidly into a deafening roar. The pneumatic arms hissed and the heavy steel gears locked into place. The smell of warm machine oil filled the air. The heartbeat of the factory had officially returned. I walked up the metal stairs to my office overlooking the production floor. I opened the mahogany door and breathed in the familiar scent of old paper and leather. The cardboard box Cameron had handed me on Tuesday was resting on the floor. I took the framed photograph of my late wife Martha out of the box and placed it exactly where it belonged. I sat down behind my heavy desk. I placed the original brass key right in the center of the wooden surface. Order had been completely restored. Over the next few months, the legal system processed the absolute destruction of Cameron Davis. He was denied bail and eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud and grand larceny. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. Rachel lost the lavish house, the sports car, and the designer clothes. She avoided prison by cooperating entirely with the federal prosecutors, but she was left with absolutely nothing. She works as a cashier at a grocery store on the other side of the city. We do not speak. Some doors once closed should never be opened again. Some betrayals are simply too deep to ever be repaired. I learned that true family is not defined by shared blood or legal marriage certificates. True family is defined by loyalty, respect, and the people who stand by you when the machines stop running. I worked with Anthony Russo to completely restructure the trust documents. I removed Rachel permanently and ensured that when I am finally gone, the factory and all its valuable patents will be owned collectively by the loyal employees who actually bleed for it. I am 71 years old, and I have never felt stronger. I am running my company, I am taking care of my people, and I am fiercely protecting the legacy my wife and I built together. Life goes on simpler, but infinitely more honest than before. Thank you for listening to my story. Please let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. If you believe that greed always destroys the greedy, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next life story.